The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton as Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Vasquez stepped out of her quarters, her combat boots hitting the pavement with the practiced rhythm of someone who had walked these grounds for nearly 8 years. At 29, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from surviving 3 deployments and earning the respect of soldiers twice her size. But today felt different. Today, she was walking into a storm she hadn't seen coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The new batch of recruits had arrived at Fort Braxton just 72 hours ago. Fresh-faced kids straight out of basic training, their eyes still bright with the kind of idealism that combat hadn't yet tempered. Maria had been assigned as their drill instructor for advanced combat training, a role she'd performed dozens of times before. She knew the drill by heart: break them down, build them up, and forge them into soldiers who could trust each other with their lives. As she approached the training grounds, Maria could hear the familiar sounds of military morning routines: the sharp crack of boots on concrete, the rhythmic chanting of cadences, and the occasional bark of commands from other instructors. The air was thick with the scent of diesel fuel and morning dew, a combination that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. What Maria didn't know was that Private Jake Morrison, a 20-year-old from suburban Phoenix, had already been running his mouth in the barracks since day one. Morrison came from a family of contractors and real estate developers, people who had never worn a uniform but had plenty of opinions about those who did. He'd enlisted not out of patriotic duty or financial necessity, but because his father thought military service would toughen him up before he took over the family business. Morrison had noticed Maria's tattoo during their first formation. It was visible on her left forearm when she rolled up her sleeves during physical training demonstrations, a detailed black and gray design that incorporated military symbols, dates, and what appeared to be coordinates. To Morrison and several other recruits, it looked like just another piece of military-themed artwork, the kind that soldiers got to look tough or commemorate their service. "Check out the drill sergeant's tattoo," Morrison had whispered to his bunkmate, Private Tommy Chen, during their first evening in the barracks. "Looks like she's trying real hard to prove something. Probably got it at some strip mall shop near base." Chen, who had joined the army to pay for college and send money home to his immigrant parents, felt uncomfortable with Morrison's tone, but said nothing. He'd learned early in basic training that sometimes it was better to keep your head down and avoid unnecessary conflict. By the second day, Morrison's comments had evolved into full-blown mockery. During meal breaks, he would imitate what he imagined was Maria's voice when she got the tattoo, creating elaborate fictional scenarios about her sitting in a tattoo parlor, trying to look hardcore for social media. His audience grew as some of the other recruits, hungry for entertainment and desperate to fit in, began to join in with their own jokes and observations. "Bet she thinks that ink makes her special," Morrison had said during their second evening, his voice carrying just loud enough for several bunks to hear. "Looks like she's a war hero or something. Probably has her Instagram handle tattooed somewhere, too." The laughter that followed wasn't universal, but it was loud enough to establish Morrison as the barracks comedian, the guy who wasn't afraid to say what everyone else was thinking, or at least what he assumed everyone else was thinking. Private Sarah Washington, one of only 4 women in the group of 32 recruits, found herself caught between worlds. She respected Staff Sergeant Vasquez's obvious competence and authority, but she was also trying to navigate the complex social dynamics of being one of the few females in a male-dominated environment. When Morrison made his jokes, she usually looked away or changed the subject, but her silence felt like complicity. Meanwhile, Maria went about her duties with the same professional demeanor she'd maintained throughout her career. She'd heard whispers and seen the sideways glances, but she'd learned long ago that respect in the military wasn't given, it was earned. And she was confident that once these recruits saw what she could do, once they understood what she'd been through, the jokes would stop. She had no idea that Morrison's mockery was about to escalate far beyond barracks room whispers. She couldn't have predicted that within days, his comments would spread beyond their training group and reach the ears of people who understood exactly what her tattoo represented. And she certainly couldn't have foreseen that this moment would become a turning point not just for her relationship with the new recruits, but for her own understanding of how her story had impacted others. As Maria prepared her lesson plans for the week, focusing on combat tactics and leadership principles, she made a mental note to keep a close eye on Morrison. Something about his attitude reminded her of soldiers she'd known who thought the military was just another stepping stone, who hadn't yet learned that service meant something deeper than personal advancement. What she didn't realize was that Morrison's attitude was about to collide head-on with the reality of who she really was and what she had sacrificed to earn every symbol inked into her skin.
The incident that would change everything began on a Wednesday morning during what should have been a routine combat training exercise. Maria had designed the day's activities around small unit tactics, with the recruits working in teams to navigate an obstacle course while carrying wounded dummy soldiers. A simulation designed to test their physical endurance, problem-solving skills, and ability to work under pressure. The recruits were struggling. The morning heat was already climbing toward 90 degrees, and the 50-pound dummies felt heavier with each passing minute. Sweat poured down their faces as they stumbled through the course, their movements becoming increasingly uncoordinated as fatigue set in. Maria watched from her observation post, taking notes on each recruit's performance and calling out corrections when necessary. She'd removed her jacket due to the heat, leaving her in a standard-issue olive-drab t-shirt that exposed her tattoo completely. The black and gray artwork stretched from her wrist to just below her elbow, intricate and detailed in a way that spoke of significant time and expense. Private Morrison's team was falling behind. As the designated team leader for this exercise, he was supposed to coordinate his squad's movements and ensure they maintained formation while carrying their dummy casualty. Instead, he was growing increasingly frustrated with his teammates' pace and had begun to take out his anger on anyone within earshot. "This is ridiculous," Morrison panted as his team struggled to lift their dummy over a wall obstacle. "Nobody actually does this stuff in real combat. This is just drill sergeant power trip nonsense." Private Chen, who was serving as Morrison's second-in-command for the exercise, glanced nervously toward Maria's position. "Keep your voice down, man. She can hear everything." But Morrison was beyond caring. The heat, exhaustion, and his growing resentment toward military authority had combined into a toxic mixture of arrogance and poor judgment. As his team finally cleared the wall obstacle and paused to catch their breath, Morrison made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. "You know what?" Morrison said, his voice deliberately loud enough to carry across the training ground. "I'm sick of pretending to respect someone just because they have some fake war story tattooed on their arm." The effect was immediate. Every recruit within a 100-yard radius stopped what they were doing. The normal sounds of the training exercise, grunting, shouting, the clatter of equipment faded into an uncomfortable silence. Maria's pen stopped moving on her clipboard. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, processing what she'd just heard. In 8 years of military service, she'd faced down enemy fighters, improvised explosive devices, and more bureaucracy than she cared to remember. But nothing had prepared her for the casual dismissal of her service by someone who had never left the safety of American soil. "Morrison." Maria's voice carried clearly across the training ground, cold and controlled. "Front and center. Now." As Morrison jogged toward her position, his earlier bravado began to evaporate. He could see the expressions on his fellow recruits' faces, a mixture of horror, embarrassment, and anticipation. Even his most loyal supporters seemed to realize he'd crossed a line. But Maria, instead of the verbal destruction everyone expected, did something far more powerful. She simply rolled up her sleeve further and extended her arm toward Morrison, giving him a clear view of every detail of her tattoo. "Tell me what you see, Private," she said quietly. Morrison squinted at the artwork, trying to make out the specific details. What he'd dismissed as generic military imagery from a distance revealed itself to be something far more complex up close. There were dates, coordinates, names, and military unit insignia woven together in an intricate design that clearly told a specific story. "I see coordinates?" Morrison ventured, his earlier confidence completely gone. 36.3158 degrees north, 68.1133 degrees east, Maria recited without looking at her arm. "Do you know what those coordinates represent, Private?" Morrison shook his head, suddenly feeling very young and very stupid. "That's the location of Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan's Khost province. Specifically, those coordinates mark the spot where I spent 365 days of my life, from 2018 to 2019. Do you see those names written in the scroll design?" Morrison leaned closer, and for the first time, he could make out the small script woven into the tattoo's design. Names. Dozens of them. "Those are the names of soldiers who didn't make it home from that deployment," Maria continued, her voice steady, but carrying a weight that made every recruit on the training ground stop and listen. 23 men and women who were alive when we landed at Chapman and who came home in flag-draped boxes. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the instructors at other training sites seemed to sense that something significant was happening and had stopped their own activities to observe. Morrison felt his stomach drop. He wanted to apologize, to take back his words, to somehow undo the last 5 minutes of his life. But Maria wasn't finished. The unit patch you see incorporated into the design represents the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, the Rakkasans. We were tasked with disrupting enemy supply lines and providing security for reconstruction efforts in one of the most dangerous regions in Afghanistan. During our deployment, we conducted 400 combat patrols and participated in 12 major operations. She pointed to another section of the tattoo, where Roman numerals were integrated into a wing design. These numbers represent the casualties from my specific unit during that deployment. Not just killed in action, but wounded as well. Purple Heart recipients, men and women who bled for the mission and for each other. By now, word was spreading across the base. Other instructors had begun to gather at the edges of the training ground, and Maria noticed several senior NCOs and officers watching from a distance. She realized that this moment had become about more than just correcting one mouthy recruit. It had become a teaching moment for everyone present. Morrison stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions of shock, shame, and growing horror as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Around him, his fellow recruits were silent, many of them staring at the ground, some even openly staring at Maria's tattoo with new understanding. The tattoo took 18 hours to complete across 3 sessions. Each name was added with ceremony and respect. Each date was verified against military records. Each coordinate was checked and double-checked for accuracy. This isn't artwork, Private Morrison. This is a memorial. It's a promise, and it's a reminder of what happens when people like you make decisions about life and death without understanding the consequences.
The weight of Maria's words settled over the training ground like a heavy blanket. Morrison felt as though the earth was shifting beneath his feet, his entire worldview crumbling with each passing second. The casual arrogance that had carried him through the first few days of training evaporated completely, replaced by a crushing sense of shame that threatened to overwhelm him. But Maria wasn't done. She had spent years carrying the weight of her experiences in silence, focusing on her duties and her soldiers rather than dwelling on the past. Now, with 32 young faces staring at her with a mixture of awe and horror, she realized that her story needed to be told, not for her own benefit, but for theirs. "I was 24 years old when I deployed to Afghanistan for the second time," she continued, her voice taking on a narrative quality that held everyone's attention. "Young enough to still believe that good intentions and proper training could protect us from everything. Old enough to understand that war doesn't care about your plans or your hopes for the future." She pointed to a specific section of her tattoo where a date was prominently displayed, September 15th, 2018. This date marks the day we lost our first soldier during that deployment, Specialist Marcus Rodriguez from San Antonio, Texas. 22 years old, married, with a daughter he'd never met because she was born while we were overseas. Rodriguez volunteered for a supply convoy that was hit by an improvised explosive device just 12 miles from base. Maria's voice remained steady, but those who knew her well could detect the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated how difficult this recounting was for her. Rodriguez was still alive when we pulled him out. He was conscious, asking about his team, worried about whether everyone else was okay. That was the kind of soldier he was, more concerned about others than himself, even as he was dying. Morrison felt tears threatening to spill down his cheeks. Around him, several other recruits were openly crying, the reality of military service hitting them in a way that no training manual or documentary could have prepared them for. We held Rodriguez's hand as the medics worked on him. We told him jokes, talked about his daughter, made plans for what we were going to do when we got home. He died 23 minutes later, with his squad mates surrounding him, making sure he wasn't alone. The silence that followed was profound. Even the sounds of normal base activity seemed muted, as if the entire installation was holding its breath. Each name on this tattoo represents a similar story, Maria said, extending her arm again so everyone could see the intricate lettering. Sergeant Jennifer Walsh from Ohio, who threw herself on a grenade to save her squad. Private First Class David Kim from California, who died providing covering fire so civilians could evacuate a combat zone. Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson from Georgia, who was killed by a sniper while trying to rescue wounded Afghan allies. She rolled her sleeve down slightly, revealing another section of the tattoo that incorporated military medals and ribbons into the design. These represent the awards our unit received during that deployment: Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts, Combat Infantry badges. But more importantly, they represent the courage and sacrifice of people who were barely older than you are now. She looked directly at Morrison, who was now visibly shaking with emotion. When you laughed at this tattoo, Private Morrison, you weren't just insulting me. You were laughing at Rodriguez's sacrifice. You were mocking Walsh's courage. You were dismissing the memory of 23 American heroes who died serving their country. The accusation hung in the air like a physical weight. Morrison opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he possibly say that would undo his actions or adequately express his remorse? But here's the thing, Maria continued, her tone softening slightly. I don't think you understood what you were doing. I think you saw someone who looked different from what you expected a war veteran to look like, and you made assumptions based on ignorance and prejudice. She gestured towards the gathering crowd of observers, which now included several high-ranking officers and senior enlisted personnel who had been drawn by reports of the confrontation. That's a dangerous habit in the military, Private Morrison. Making assumptions about people based on appearances can get you killed in combat. It can get your teammates killed. And it can prevent you from learning from people who have experiences that could save your life someday. At the edge of the crowd, Command Sergeant Major Williams, a 30-year veteran with 4 combat deployments, stepped forward. His presence immediately commanded attention, and even Maria straightened her posture in acknowledgement of her rank. Staff Sergeant, Williams called out, his gravelly voice carrying clearly across the training ground. Is there a problem here? Maria turned towards the senior NCO, her mind racing. She knew that this situation had escalated far beyond normal training protocols, and she wasn't sure whether she was about to be commended or reprimanded for the way she'd handled Morrison's disrespect. Command Sergeant Major, Morrison made some inappropriate comments about my tattoo. I was providing him with context for his education. Williams nodded slowly, his eyes taking in the scene, the emotional recruits, the gathering crowd of observers, and Maria's exposed tattoo. As he moved closer, his expression changed, and Maria realized that he was studying her tattoo with intense interest. Staff Sergeant, would you mind showing me those coordinates again? Maria extended her arm, wondering where this was leading. Williams examined the tattoo carefully, his weathered face growing increasingly serious as he read the dates, names, and military symbols. After what felt like an eternity, Williams stepped back and looked Maria directly in the eyes. 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, FOB Chapman, 2018 to 2019 deployment. Yes, Command Sergeant Major. Williams nodded slowly, then did something that shocked everyone present. He came to attention and rendered a sharp, formal salute. "It's an honor to meet you, Staff Sergeant Vasquez," he said, his voice carrying across the silent training ground. "I served as liaison to your unit during Operation Enduring Sentinel. I knew many of the soldiers whose names you carry. The impact of this moment was immediate and profound. Every recruit, every instructor, and every observer suddenly understood that they were witnessing something far more significant than a routine training correction. But the revelations were just beginning."
Command Sergeant Major Williams maintained his salute until Maria returned it, then stepped closer, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone that somehow still carried to every person present. "I remember the night we lost Rodriguez," Williams said, his words causing several recruits to gasp. "I was at the forward command post when the call came in about the IED. I remember the medevac request, the casualty reports, and the aftermath. But what I remember most clearly was the report I received from your commanding officer about how your squad handled the situation." Williams turned to address the crowd of recruits and observers, his command presence filling the space. "What Staff Sergeant Vasquez hasn't told you is that after Rodriguez was killed, her squad volunteered to continue the supply run. They could have returned to base, standard protocol, after losing a man. Instead, they insisted on completing the mission because they knew the forward outpost was critically low on medical supplies." Maria felt a flush of embarrassment. She'd never been comfortable with praise, preferring to focus on the job at hand rather than dwelling on past actions. "That supply run saved lives," Williams continued. "The medical supplies they delivered were used to treat 14 wounded Afghan civilians who were brought to the outpost later that day after a separate attack. If Staff Sergeant Vasquez and her team had returned to base, those civilians would have died." The silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable quiet that had pervaded the training ground earlier. This was the silence of respect, of people processing information that challenged their preconceptions and expanded their understanding of what military service really meant. Private Chen, who had remained quiet throughout Morrison's earlier mockery, raised his hand tentatively. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, how do you carry all of that? How do you deal with losing so many people?" The question was clearly difficult for Maria to answer. She looked down at her tattoo, then back at the young faces surrounding her. "You never stop carrying it," she said finally. "Every name on this tattoo is with me every day. When I wake up, when I go to sleep, when I make decisions about training or tactics or life. They're all still here." She tapped her chest, over her heart. "But you learn to carry it in a way that honors their sacrifice instead of being crushed by it. You use their memory to make you better, stronger, more determined to protect the people who are still alive." Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Major Rebecca Foster, the base's executive officer, had been watching from the administrative building and decided to join the gathering. As she approached, Maria noticed that several other senior officers were following, including the base commander, Colonel James Mitchell. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Major Foster called out, "I think everyone here would benefit from understanding the full context of your service record." Maria felt a moment of panic. Her service record contained information she preferred to keep private, not out of shame, but because she believed actions spoke louder than credentials. "Ma'am, I'm not sure that's necessary." "I think it is," Colonel Mitchell interrupted, having reached the group. His presence immediately elevated the significance of the moment. When a base commander took time out of his schedule to address a training exercise, everyone knew something important was happening. Colonel Mitchell pulled out his smartphone and began reading from what was clearly an official military document.
Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Vasquez, serial number... He paused, looking at Maria. Actually, we don't need the serial number. Let's focus on the relevant information. He cleared his throat and continued reading. 2 Bronze Star medals, 1 with V device for valor. Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster, indicating multiple awards. Combat Infantry Badge. Afghan Campaign Medal with 4 campaign stars. NATO Medal for Afghanistan. Army Commendation Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. With each award mentioned, the recruits' expressions grew more amazed. Morrison looked as though he wanted to disappear entirely. But here's the one that's most relevant to today's discussion. Colonel Mitchell continued. The Silver Star. A collective gasp arose from the crowd. The Silver Star was the 3rd highest military decoration for valor, an award that most soldiers never even witnessed being presented, let alone earned themselves. The citation reads, Colonel Mitchell continued, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States while serving as squad leader with the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment during combat operations in Afghanistan on March 14, 2019. Maria closed her eyes, knowing what was coming next. March 14th was a date she tried to forget, a day that haunted her dreams and had fundamentally changed her understanding of leadership, sacrifice, and survival. On this date, Staff Sergeant Vasquez's squad was conducting a patrol in the Coast Province when they encountered a complex ambush involving approximately 30 enemy fighters armed with small arms, rocket-propelled grenades, and improvised explosive devices. The recruits were hanging on every word, their earlier exhaustion from the training exercise completely forgotten. When the initial assault wounded 4 members of her 8-person squad, including her medic, Staff Sergeant Vasquez made the decision to expose herself to direct enemy fire in order to reach the wounded soldiers and provide medical aid. Colonel Mitchell paused, looking at Maria with obvious respect. Staff Sergeant Vasquez spent 47 minutes under direct enemy fire, treating wounded soldiers and coordinating the squad's defense. When ammunition ran low, she made multiple trips across open ground to redistribute supplies from wounded soldiers to those who still able to fight. Morrison was now openly weeping, the full weight of his earlier mockery crushing down on him like a physical burden. The citation continues, Colonel Mitchell said, his voice growing more solemn. Staff Sergeant Vasquez's actions directly resulted in saving the lives of 3 critically wounded soldiers and maintaining the squad's defensive position until reinforcements arrived. When Colonel Mitchell finished reading, the silence was profound. Maria stood rigidly at attention, her face flushed with embarrassment, but her posture reflected years of military discipline. What the citation doesn't mention, Command Sergeant Major Williams added, is that Staff Sergeant Vasquez was wounded twice during that engagement. She took shrapnel in her shoulder and leg but continued to fight and treat wounded soldiers for another 30 minutes before accepting medical aid herself.
The revelation about Maria's Silver Star and the circumstances under which she earned it created a ripple effect that extended far beyond the training ground. Within hours, word had spread throughout Fort Braxton, and by evening, the story had reached soldiers and veterans across the military community through social media and unofficial communication channels. But the immediate impact was on the 32 recruits who had witnessed Morrison's mockery and Maria's subsequent response. For most of them, this was their first real glimpse into the reality of military service. The first time they understood that the person training them wasn't just another soldier following orders, but a genuine war hero who had faced death and made impossible decisions under circumstances they could barely imagine. Private Sarah Washington found herself reevaluating everything she thought she knew about military leadership. As one of only 4 women in the training group, she had been watching Maria carefully, looking for signs of how to navigate the challenges of being female in a male-dominated environment. Now she realized she had been learning from someone whose courage and competence had been tested in ways that most soldiers, regardless of gender, would never face. "Staff Sergeant," Washington approached Maria after the crowd had dispersed and training had resumed. "Can I ask you something personal?" Maria looked up from the equipment inventory she was conducting, noting the serious expression on the young recruit's face. "What's on your mind, Private Washington?" "How do you deal with being underestimated? I mean, before today, when people looked at you and didn't know your story, how did you handle their assumptions?" It was a perceptive question, one that got to the heart of many of the challenges Maria had faced throughout her career. She set down her clipboard and considered her response carefully. "You let your actions speak louder than their assumptions," Maria said finally. "You can't control what people think when they first meet you, but you can control how you respond to their doubts. Every day you prove who you are through your competence, your dedication, and your integrity." She gestured toward the training equipment around them. "Some people will always look at me and see limitations. I'm too small, too young, too female, whatever. But the soldiers I've served with in combat know who I am because they've seen me under pressure. They've watched me make decisions when lives were on the line. That's the only opinion that really matters." Washington nodded thoughtfully. "What about the tattoo? Why did you decide to make your service so visible?" Maria unconsciously touched her forearm where the tattoo lay hidden beneath her sleeve. "The tattoo isn't about making my service visible. It's about making sure the soldiers who didn't come home remain visible. Every name on my arm represents someone who deserves to be remembered, someone whose sacrifice should never be forgotten or dismissed." She paused, thinking about Morrison's earlier comments and the pain they had caused. When Private Morrison laughed at my tattoo, he wasn't just insulting me. He was laughing at Rodriguez's memory, at Walsh's courage, at Thompson's dedication. That's not something I could let stand, regardless of the consequences. Meanwhile, Morrison himself was struggling with emotions he wasn't equipped to handle. He had enlisted in the Army with a casual attitude toward military service, viewing it as a temporary inconvenience before returning to civilian life and the family business. Now, faced with the reality of what military service actually meant, he felt lost and overwhelmed. He had attempted to apologize to Maria immediately after Colonel Mitchell finished reading her citations, but she had been surrounded by officers and other personnel. Now, as evening approached and the base settled into its normal routine, Morrison found himself outside Maria's office, struggling to find the courage to knock. "Come in," Maria's voice called out before he had made a decision. Morrison entered to find Maria working on training schedules for the following week, her desk covered with lesson plans and evaluation forms. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Private Morrison, what can I do for you?" "Staff Sergeant, Morrison's voice caught in his throat. "I came to apologize, but I don't think there are words for what I did. I don't think sorry is enough." Maria leaned back in her chair, studying the young soldier's face. She could see genuine remorse and shame, but also confusion and fear. It reminded her of some of the young soldiers she had served with during her deployments, kids who joined the military without fully understanding what they were signing up for. "You're right," she said finally. "Sorry isn't enough, but it's a start." Morrison's shoulders sagged with relief and despair in equal measure. "I don't know how to make this right. I don't know how to take back what I said or undo the damage I caused." Maria stood up and walked around her desk and leaned against the front edge so she could look Morrison directly in the eye. "You can't take it back," she said, "but you can learn from it. You can use this experience to become the kind of soldier, the kind of person who would never make that mistake again." She pointed toward the window that overlooked the training ground where the day's events had unfolded. "Do you know why I became a drill instructor, Private Morrison?" Morrison shook his head. "Because I've seen what happens when soldiers aren't properly prepared for the reality of military service.
I've watched good people die because they didn't understand their equipment, their tactics, or their responsibilities to their teammates. She paused, letting that sink in. My job isn't to break you down or humiliate you. My job is to prepare you for situations where your knowledge, your skills, and your character might be the only thing standing between your squad and disaster. Morrison felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than shame. What can I do? How can I earn back your respect and the respect of my fellow soldiers? Maria smiled for the first time since the incident began. You earn it the same way everyone else does, through your actions, your dedication, and your commitment to the soldiers around you. You proved today was a learning experience, not a character flaw. She walked back to her desk and pulled out a thick manual. You're going to start by learning everything you can about military history, traditions, and the sacrifices of the soldiers who came before you. This is a compilation of Medal of Honor citations from the last 50 years. You're going to read every single one, and you're going to write a report about what you learned. Morrison accepted the manual gratefully, understanding that he was being given a chance at redemption. Thank you, Staff Sergeant. I won't let you down. Don't do it for me. Do it for Rodriguez, Walsh, Compson, and all the others whose names you laughed at today. Do it for the soldiers you might serve with someday. Do it because it's the right thing to do.
Word of the day's events had spread far beyond Fort Braxton by evening, carried through the interconnected networks of military families, veterans organizations, and social media communities that linked current and former service members across the country. Maria's story, combined with Morrison's public humiliation and redemption, had touched a nerve in the military community and beyond. Master Sergeant Robert Chen, Tommy Chen's uncle and a two-tour Iraq veteran, called his nephew that evening after hearing about the incident through the informal communication networks that connected military families. Tommy, his uncle's voice was serious over the phone, I heard about what happened during your training today. I heard about Staff Sergeant Vasquez and that tattoo. Tommy Chen had been dreading this conversation. His uncle had been instrumental in his decision to join the army, and Tommy knew that his failure to speak up during Morrison's mockery would be seen as a betrayal of military values. Uncle Robert, I should have said something. I should have stopped Morrison before it went so far. Yes, you should have, his uncle replied bluntly, but the important thing is that you understand that now. The military isn't just about following orders, Tommy. It's about having the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular. Tommy felt the weight of his uncle's disappointment, but also heard something else in his voice. Hope for redemption. What do I do now? Tommy asked. You learn from this. You make sure it never happens again, and you honor the soldiers whose memory was disrespected today by becoming the kind of soldier who would make them proud. His uncle paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. Tommy, I want to tell you something about that tattoo, about those coordinates Staff Sergeant Vasquez carries. FOB Chapman, 2018-2019. I know soldiers who were stationed there during that deployment. I know the stories behind some of those names. Tommy listened intently as his uncle described the conditions at Forward Operating Base Chapman, the constant threat of attack, the daily patrols through hostile territory, and the tight-knit bonds formed between soldiers who depended on each other for survival. Your staff sergeant didn't just serve at Chapman, his uncle continued. She was part of one of the most effective squads in the entire theater of operations. Other units requested her team for the most dangerous missions because they knew she would bring her people home. Tommy felt a chill run down his spine as he began to understand the full magnitude of what had happened that day. The night she earned her Silver Star, March 14, 2019, I was at Bagram Air Base when the casualty reports came in. We all held our breath waiting to see how many names would be on that list. When we learned that she had managed to keep her entire squad alive, despite being outnumbered 6-1, despite being wounded herself, despite running out of ammunition twice, that's when we knew we were dealing with someone special. Tommy's uncle's voice took on a reverent tone that Tommy had never heard before. There are soldiers with 20 years of service who never faced the kind of situation your staff sergeant faced that day. There are generals who built their entire careers without demonstrating the kind of courage and leadership she showed in 47 minutes under fire. The conversation continued for another hour, with Tommy's uncle sharing stories about other soldiers he'd known, other heroes whose sacrifices had gone unrecognized by the general public but were legendary within military circles. By the time they hung up, Tommy felt as though he had been given a graduate-level education in military values and traditions. The next morning brought unexpected developments. Maria arrived at the training ground to find that someone had left flowers at the obstacle course where the previous day's confrontation had occurred. Attached was a simple note: "Thank you for your service and for honoring our fallen. The families of FOB Chapman." Colonel Mitchell appeared shortly after Maria discovered the flowers, accompanied by a visitor Maria hadn't expected, General Patricia Hayes, the commanding general of the entire military district. The presence of a general officer at a routine training exercise was unprecedented and immediately drew the attention of everyone on the base. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," General Hayes said as she approached, "I've been hearing remarkable things about yesterday's events." Maria came to attention, unsure what to expect from this high-level visit. "General, I was simply correcting a discipline issue during training." General Hayes smiled, an expression that transformed her stern features and revealed the humanity behind the rank and authority. "From what I understand, you did much more than that. You provided these young soldiers with a lesson about service, sacrifice, and respect that they'll carry with them for the rest of their careers." She gestured toward the gathered recruits, who were watching the interaction with obvious fascination. "Yesterday's events have resonated far beyond this base," General Hayes continued. "I've received calls from veterans organizations, Gold Star families, and military leaders across the country. Your story, and your tattoo, have reminded people why we serve and what that service means." She pulled out a folder and extracted several letters. "These are from the families of some of the soldiers whose names you carry on your arm. They wanted you to know how much it means to them that their loved ones are remembered and honored in such a permanent way." Maria felt tears threatening as General Hayes handed her the letters. She hadn't anticipated that her tattoo would have meaning beyond her own need to remember and honor her fallen comrades. "But there's something else," General Hayes continued. "The Army is launching a new initiative to help soldiers process combat trauma and honor fallen comrades. We want you to help develop and lead this program." The offer was both an honor and a challenge. It would mean leaving her current position, taking on new responsibilities, and sharing her experiences with soldiers across the military. It would also mean confronting her own trauma in ways she had been avoiding. "General, I'm honored by the opportunity, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for that kind of responsibility." General Hayes looked at Maria with an expression that mixed respect, understanding, and gentle firmness. "Staff Sergeant, you've spent years carrying the names and memories of fallen soldiers. You've turned your pain into purpose, your trauma into teaching. You've shown these recruits, and now soldiers across the country, what it means to honor sacrifice while continuing to serve." She gestured toward Maria's concealed tattoo. "That artwork on your arm isn't just a memorial, it's a testament to resilience, to the power of remembrance, and to the bonds that hold military units together. Those are exactly the lessons we need to share with soldiers who are struggling with their own trauma and loss." Maria looked out at the recruits, who were now watching her with expressions of respect and admiration, rather than the casual indifference they'd shown just 2 days earlier. She thought about Morrison's transformation, about the letters from Gold Star families, about the opportunity to help other soldiers process their experiences in healthy ways. "When would this program begin, General?" "We'd like you to start developing the curriculum immediately. You'd work with psychologists, chaplains, and other combat veterans to create a comprehensive program that addresses trauma, grief, and the importance of honoring fallen comrades." The weight of the decision settled on Maria's shoulders. Accepting would mean stepping out of her comfort zone, sharing her story repeatedly, and reliving painful memories in service to helping others. Declining would mean continuing in her current role, training recruits, and maintaining the relative privacy she'd built around her experiences. But as she looked at the faces of the young soldiers around her, she realized that the decision had already been made.
Morrison's mockery had forced her to share her story, and the response had shown her that her experiences could have value beyond her own healing. When would this program begin, General?
3 weeks after the incident that had transformed everything, Maria found herself standing in front of a much different audience. The Pentagon conference room was filled with senior military officials, psychologists, chaplains, and veteran advocates, all gathered to hear her present the preliminary framework for what would become known as the Memorial and Resilience Program. The irony wasn't lost on her. A tattoo that one ignorant recruit had mocked as fake war story artwork was now the inspiration for a military-wide initiative to help soldiers process combat trauma and honor fallen comrades. The program would eventually serve thousands of service members, but it had begun with one moment of disrespect that forced her to share a story she'd kept largely private for years. The core principle of the Memorial and Resilience Program, Maria explained to the assembled officials, is that healing and honor are not mutually exclusive. We can process our trauma while still maintaining the sacred duty to remember those we've lost. General Hayes, who had become Maria's primary advocate for the program, nodded approvingly from her seat in the front row. The weeks since their conversation at Fort Braxton had been a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and program development, but Maria had thrown herself into the work with the same dedication she'd shown in combat. Traditional approaches to combat trauma have sometimes emphasized moving on or letting go. But for many combat veterans, the idea of letting go feels like abandoning the memory of fallen comrades. This program recognizes that remembrance can be a source of strength rather than just a source of pain. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a psychologist specializing in combat trauma, raised her hand with a question. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, can you elaborate on how physical memorials, like tattoos, fit into the healing process? Maria touched her arm unconsciously, feeling the outline of her tattoo beneath her dress uniform sleeve. Physical memorials serve multiple purposes. First, they ensure that the fallen are never forgotten, which honors their sacrifice and maintains the bonds formed in combat. Second, they provide a focal point for processing grief and trauma in a controlled, intentional way. Finally, they can serve as conversation starters, allowing veterans to share their stories when they're ready. She thought about Morrison, who had spent the 3 weeks since the incident immersing himself in military history and had become one of the most dedicated recruits in his class. His transformation had been remarkable, driven by genuine remorse and a newfound understanding of what military service really meant. The key is ensuring that these memorials serve healing rather than perpetuating trauma. That requires proper support, counseling, and community understanding. Colonel James Patterson, a veteran of multiple deployments who now worked in military mental health, leaned forward with interest. How do we scale this approach? How do we move from individual healing to unit-wide or even military-wide cultural change? It was a question Maria had been grappling with since accepting the assignment. The answer, she realized, lay in the events of the past 3 weeks at Fort Braxton. We start with education and story sharing. What happened at my base 3 weeks ago demonstrated the power of authentic stories to change perspectives and build understanding. When people understand the real meaning behind memorial tattoos, military traditions, and veteran experiences, they respond with respect rather than mockery. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, which showed statistics about the incident's impact. The story had spread through social media, veterans organizations, and military communities, generating thousands of positive responses and connecting veterans with similar experiences. But we also need to address the Morrison problem, Maria continued, using a term that had developed within the program team, to describe soldiers who join the military without understanding its deeper meaning or traditions. The Morrison problem? Dr. Martinez asked. Soldiers who enter the military with casual attitudes towards service, who view military traditions and symbols as mere decorations rather than sacred trusts. These soldiers aren't necessarily bad people, but they lack the context to understand what they're part of.
Maria thought about Morrison's transformation over the past 3 weeks. His reading assignments had expanded beyond the Medal of Honor citations she had initially given him. He'd begun reaching out to veterans organizations, attending memorial services, and asking thoughtful questions about military history and traditions. Private Morrison's transformation demonstrates that education and exposure to authentic stories can change perspectives dramatically. The key is catching these attitudes early and providing proper context before they lead to more serious problems. General Hayes stood up, indicating that the formal presentation was concluding. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, this program represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking the military needs to address combat trauma and memorial culture. We're prepared to move forward with a pilot program at 5 bases, with plans for military-wide implementation if the results are positive. Maria felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The pilot program would serve as a test case for ideas that had grown out of her personal experience and the unexpected consequences of one recruit's mockery. General, I'm honored to lead this initiative, but I want to emphasize that this program's success will depend on authentic stories from real veterans. We can't rely on generic approaches or theoretical frameworks. This has to be grounded in real experiences and real relationships. Understood, General Hayes replied. That's exactly why you're the right person to lead it. As the meeting concluded and participants filed out of the conference room, Maria found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a young soldier enlisting out of economic necessity, through multiple combat deployments, to a senior NCO whose personal story had become a catalyst for military-wide change. But mostly, she thought about the names tattooed on her arm, and what they would think of this development. Rodriguez, Walsh, Thompson, and the others had died serving their country, never knowing that their memory would eventually help heal other soldiers struggling with similar losses.
Back at Fort Braxton, the ripple effects of Maria's story continued to spread in ways that surprised everyone involved. Morrison had become an unofficial spokesman for the transformative power of understanding military traditions, sharing his experience with new groups of recruits and emphasizing the importance of respecting the stories and symbols carried by veteran soldiers. 3 weeks ago, I was the guy who laughed at a tattoo, Morrison told a group of newly arrived recruits during an informal evening session in the barracks. I thought I was being clever, making jokes about something I didn't understand. I had no idea that I was mocking the memory of American heroes. The new recruits listened intently, having heard various versions of the story through the rumor mill that connected all military bases. But hearing it directly from Morrison carried a weight that secondhand accounts couldn't match. Staff Sergeant Vasquez didn't just correct my ignorance, Morrison continued. She taught me that everything in the military has meaning, has history, has sacrifice behind it. The rank insignia on your uniform, the unit patches, the ribbons and medals, they all represent stories of people who served before us. Private Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the Jennifer Walsh whose name appeared on Maria's tattoo, raised her hand with the question. How do we know which stories to ask about and which ones are too personal or painful to discuss? It was a thoughtful question that demonstrated the kind of sensitivity Morrison had learned to appreciate over the past weeks. You start by showing respect. You don't make assumptions, you don't make jokes, and you definitely don't mock what you don't understand. If someone wants to share their story, they will. If they don't, you respect that too. He gestured toward the window that overlooked the training ground where the original incident had occurred. But here's the thing. When Staff Sergeant Vasquez shared her story, it wasn't just about correcting my behavior. It was about honoring the soldiers whose names she carries. She turned my moment of stupidity into a teaching moment that honored their memory. Meanwhile, the story had reached far beyond military circles. Maria's tattoo and the incident it had sparked had been featured in veterans magazines, military blogs, and mainstream news outlets.
The coverage had brought attention not just to her individual story, but to the broader issues of memorial culture, combat trauma, and the gap between military and civilian understanding of veteran experiences. Sarah Rodriguez, the daughter of Specialist Marcus Rodriguez, whose name appeared prominently on Maria's tattoo, had seen one of these news stories and reached out through official channels to request contact with Maria. The request had made its way through military bureaucracy and reached Maria just as she was returning from her Pentagon presentation. The phone call was scheduled for a Tuesday evening, and Maria found herself more nervous than she'd been before any combat mission. How do you speak to the daughter of a man who died in your arms? How do you explain the weight of carrying someone's memory for years? How do you honor a father the daughter had never really known? Staff Sergeant Vasquez. The voice on the phone was young, probably early 20s, with a slight Texas accent that reminded Maria immediately of Marcus. Yes, this is Staff Sergeant Vasquez. Are you Sarah Rodriguez? Yes, ma'am. I'm Marcus Rodriguez's daughter. I saw the news story about your tattoo and what happened with that recruit. I wanted to thank you for remembering my father. Maria felt tears threatening and took a moment to compose herself. Sarah, your father was an exceptional soldier and a good man. Carrying his name is an honor, not a burden. Can you tell me about him? I mean, I know the official story, but I was just a baby when he deployed. My mom has told me what she could, but she wasn't there with him. For the next hour, Maria shared memories of Marcus Rodriguez that she had never spoken aloud before. She talked about his sense of humor, his dedication to his squad, his excitement about becoming a father, and his courage during the convoy that cost him his life. He carried a picture of you, Maria told Sarah. Even though you were just a baby, he would show it to everyone. He'd talk about what he was going to teach you when he got home, the places he wanted to take you, the kind of father he wanted to be. Sarah was crying openly now, but I could tell they were healing tears rather than purely sad ones. He never got to meet me, Sarah said, but through your stories, through your tattoo, it's like he's still here somehow. He is still here, Maria replied. Every time someone sees his name on my arm and asks about it, your father's story gets told. Every time a soldier learns about his sacrifice, his memory lives on. That's why I got the tattoo, not for me, but for him and for all the others. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Sarah asking detailed questions about her father's personality, his relationships with other soldiers, and his final moments. Maria answered everything, honestly but gently, providing the human details that official casualty reports could never capture. Staff Sergeant, Sarah said as the conversation was winding down, I want you to know that what you did, sharing your story, defending those names against that recruit's mockery, it means everything to families like mine. It shows that our loved ones aren't forgotten, that their sacrifice still matters. After the call ended, Maria sat in her quarters for a long time, processing the conversation and its implications. She'd always viewed her tattoo as a personal memorial, a way of carrying her fallen comrades with her. But Sarah's gratitude had shown her that the tattoo served a larger purpose. It connected families to the memories of their lost loved ones and ensured that sacrifice was remembered by the military community. 2 days later, Maria received a package with no return address. Inside was a photo of a young woman in a college graduation gown with a note written in careful handwriting. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, this is me graduating from college last month. I studied education because I want to teach children about history and service, inspired by what my father died for. I wanted you to see that his sacrifice is still creating positive change in the world. Thank you for carrying his memory and sharing his story. Sarah Rodriguez.
The pilot program for the Memorial and Resilience Program launched 6 weeks after the original incident at Fort Braxton, with Maria serving as the lead instructor at the first implementation site.
The program combined group therapy sessions, educational components about military history and traditions, and structured memorial activities designed to help soldiers process combat trauma while honoring fallen comrades. The first group of participants consisted of 20 soldiers from various units, all of whom had experienced combat deployments and were struggling with different aspects of trauma, grief, and readjustment. Maria had worried that her story might not resonate with soldiers from different backgrounds and experiences, but the initial sessions quickly proved her concerns unfounded. Sergeant First Class David Kim, a 3-tour Afghanistan veteran, had been skeptical about the program when his commanding officer recommended it. He'd tried traditional counseling approaches without much success and wasn't convinced that talking about his experiences would accomplish anything meaningful. "I don't see how sharing war stories is going to fix anything," Kim had told Maria during their first individual session. "What's done is done. The dead are dead. Talking about it just makes it hurt more." Maria understood Kim's resistance. She'd felt the same way for years after her deployments, preferring to focus on current duties rather than processing past trauma. "You're right that talking alone doesn't fix everything," Maria replied. "But carrying trauma in silence doesn't fix anything either. It just lets the pain eat away at you from the inside." She rolled up her sleeve, exposing her tattoo to Kim's scrutiny. "I didn't get this tattoo to fix my trauma. I got it to ensure that my fallen comrades weren't forgotten, and to carry their memory in a way that honored their sacrifice. The healing came later, as an unexpected side effect of the remembrance." Kim studied the intricate artwork, reading the names and dates that chronicled Maria's deployment experiences. "How many of these soldiers did you know personally?" "All of them. Some were closer friends than others, but I served with every person whose name is on my arm. I was there when some of them died. I spoke at memorial services for others. I helped pack their belongings to send home to their families." Kim was quiet for several minutes, processing this information. "I lost my squad leader during my second deployment, Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, no relation to the recruit in your story. He was killed by an IED while we were on patrol in Kandahar province." Maria waited, recognizing the signs of someone who was ready to share a story they'd been carrying alone for too long. "Chen was the best NCO I ever served under," Kim continued. "Fair, competent, always looked out for his soldiers. He had 2 kids back home, a boy and a girl. He'd show us pictures and tell us about their school activities, their sports teams, their report cards." Kim's voice was beginning to crack with emotion. "The IED that killed him was meant for me. I was supposed to be walking point that day, but Chen switched positions with me at the last minute because he thought he saw something suspicious ahead. He died in my place." Maria understood the guilt Kim was carrying and the weight of Chen's sacrifice. "Have you ever honored Chen's memory in any specific way?" Maria asked. "I send money to his family every year on the anniversary of his death. I've never told anyone about it, not even my wife." "That's a meaningful way to honor him, but it sounds like you're carrying his memory alone, in private. Have you considered finding ways to share his story, to ensure that other soldiers know about his sacrifice?" The question opened a conversation that continued for weeks, with Kim gradually opening up about his experiences, his guilt, and his struggle to find meaning in Chen's death. He began attending the group sessions, initially as a skeptical observer, but gradually as an active participant. The breakthrough came during the 4th group session, when Maria asked participants to share stories about soldiers they'd lost during their deployments. Kim volunteered to speak about Staff Sergeant Chen, describing his leadership, his dedication to his soldiers, and the circumstances of his death. "Chen died protecting his soldiers," Kim told the group. "He saw a threat and put himself between danger and the people under his command. That's the kind of leader he was, and that's the kind of soldier I want to be in his memory." The response from other group members was immediate and supportive. Several participants shared similar stories of leaders and comrades they'd lost, creating a space where grief and guilt could be processed collectively rather than carried alone. Master Sergeant Patricia Williams, a female combat veteran who had joined the group to address trauma from her Iraq deployment, spoke up after Kim finished his story. "What you're describing, carrying the memory of fallen comrades while struggling with survivor guilt, that's something most of us deal with. But hearing how you honored Chen's memory, how you've let his example influence your own leadership, that shows that his death had meaning." The session continued for another hour, with participants sharing stories, offering support, and discussing ways to honor fallen comrades that went beyond private grief. For the first time since joining the program, Kim felt like he was part of a community that understood his experiences and shared his commitment to remembering the fallen. After the session, Kim approached Maria with a request that surprised her. "Staff Sergeant, I want to get a memorial tattoo for Chen. Something that honors his memory and tells his story. Would you help me design it?" Maria felt a mixture of honor and responsibility. She understood that tattoos weren't the right memorial choice for everyone, but for Kim, the idea seemed to represent a healthy way of processing his grief while honoring his fallen leader. "I'd be honored to help," Maria replied. "But this needs to be your design, your way of remembering Chen. I can share what went into my tattoo and how I made those choices, but your memorial needs to be personal to you and meaningful for your relationship with him." Over the following weeks, Kim worked with Maria to design a tattoo that incorporated elements of Chen's service, his unit insignia, the coordinates of the location where he died, and personal symbols that represented their relationship as leader and subordinate. The process of designing the memorial became part of Kim's healing process, forcing him to think about Chen's life and sacrifice in new ways. The tattoo session itself became a group event, with several other program participants attending to support Kim and witness the completion of his memorial. As the tattoo artist worked, Kim shared stories about Chen that he'd never told anyone, describing his leadership style, his sense of humor, and his dedication to his soldiers. "This isn't just a tattoo," Kim told the group as the artist added the final details. "This is a promise that Chen's memory will live on, that his sacrifice won't be forgotten, and that the lessons he taught me will influence how I lead other soldiers."
6 months after the incident that started everything, Maria found herself back at Fort Braxton, but in a very different capacity. She was returning as a visiting instructor to evaluate the success of the Memorial and Resilience Program's implementation, and to check on the soldiers who had been part of the original story. The base looked the same, but the atmosphere felt different. Word of the program's success had spread throughout the military community, and Fort Braxton had become something of a model for how bases could address combat trauma while honoring military traditions. Morrison was waiting for her at the gate, now wearing the stripes of a private first class and serving as a pure mentor for new recruits. His transformation over the past 6 months had been remarkable, driven by genuine remorse and a newfound understanding of what military service really meant. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Morrison said as he saluted, his bearing much more professional than it had been during their first encounter. "Welcome back to Fort Braxton." Maria returned the salute, noting the confidence in Morrison's posture and the respect in his voice. "Private First Class Morrison, I understand you've been doing excellent work with the new recruits." "Yes, ma'am. I've been sharing the story of what happened between us, helping new soldiers understand the importance of respecting military traditions and the experiences of veteran soldiers." They walked together toward the training area where Maria would be conducting her evaluation, passing the obstacle course where the original confrontation had occurred. Someone had placed a small memorial plaque near the course, dedicated to the soldiers whose names appeared on Maria's tattoo. "How do the new recruits respond when you tell them about your mistake?" Maria asked. Morrison considered the question carefully before responding. "Most of them are shocked that I could have been so ignorant and disrespectful, but I think that's the point.
They see how easy it is to make assumptions about people and situations you don't understand. It makes them more thoughtful about how they interact with veteran soldiers and military traditions. As they reached the training area, Maria could see a group of new recruits engaged in the same type of combat training exercise where Morrison had made his disrespectful comments 6 months earlier. But the atmosphere was completely different, respectful, focused, and professional. Command Sergeant Major Williams approached as Maria was observing the training sessions, his familiar presence a reminder of how much had changed since that pivotal day. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Williams called out, "it's good to have you back. I think you'll be pleased with what you see." Maria spent the next several hours observing training sessions, interviewing soldiers, and reviewing program implementation data. The results exceeded her expectations in almost every measurable category. Instances of disrespectful behavior toward veteran soldiers had dropped by 75%. Participation in voluntary military history and tradition education programs had increased by over 200%. Most importantly, soldiers who had experienced combat trauma were seeking help at much higher rates, with the stigma around mental health support significantly reduced. The key breakthrough, Williams explained as they reviewed the data, was making memorial culture and trauma treatment part of the same conversation. Soldiers who might have been reluctant to seek help for PTSD or survivor guilt were willing to participate in programs that honored fallen comrades. During her visit, Maria also met with Tommy Chen, who had become one of the most dedicated soldiers in his training class. His uncle's conversation about military values and traditions had inspired him to take a leadership role in promoting respectful behavior and military education among his peers. "Staff Sergeant," Chen approached her after a training session, "I wanted to thank you for the lesson you taught us that day. Not just about your tattoo and your service, but about having the courage to stand up for what's right." "What do you mean?" Maria asked. "I should have stopped Morrison's comments before they went so far. I knew what he was saying was wrong, but I didn't have the courage to confront him. Your example showed me that sometimes leadership means being willing to make people uncomfortable in service of doing what's right." He paused, then added, "I've been accepted for officer candidate school. I want to become the kind of leader who creates environments where soldiers like Morrison learn to respect service and sacrifice before they have a chance to disrespect it." The success stories continued throughout Maria's evaluation visit. Sarah Washington had been selected for advanced leadership training and was being considered for special operations selection. Private Walsh had started a voluntary military history study group that met weekly to discuss the stories and traditions behind various military customs and symbols. But perhaps the most meaningful moment of the visit came when Marie received an unexpected visitor at her temporary quarters. Sarah Rodriguez, the daughter of specialist Marcus Rodriguez, had driven from San Antonio to meet the woman who carried her father's memory. The meeting was emotional for both women, but it was also healing. Sarah had graduated from college and was working as an elementary school teacher, inspired by her father's service to dedicate her life to educating young people about history, sacrifice, and service. "I tell my students about my father every Veterans Day," Sarah explained. "I tell them about his courage, his dedication to his fellow soldiers, and his sacrifice for his country. But I also tell you, about how you've kept his memory alive and honored his sacrifice." Maria felt the weight of responsibility and honor that came with carrying the memories of fallen soldiers, but she also felt something she hadn't expected, a sense of completion, of purpose fulfilled. "Your father's sacrifice hasn't been forgotten," Maria told Sarah. "Through the program that grew out of his memory, through the soldiers who now understand the meaning behind memorial traditions, through your work as a teacher, his impact continues to grow." As Maria prepared to leave Fort Braxton and return to her duties developing the Memorial and Resilience Program, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point. A moment of disrespect had become a catalyst for military-wide change. A personal memorial had become the foundation for helping thousands of soldiers process trauma and honor fallen comrades. But most importantly, the names tattooed on her arm, Rodriguez, Walsh, Thompson, and all the others, had become more than personal memories. They had become symbols of sacrifice that continued to inspire and teach new generations of soldiers.
The last stop on her evaluation visit was the base memorial wall, where the names of all soldiers from Fort Braxton who had died in service were engraved in black granite. As she stood before the wall, reading names and remembering faces, Maria realized that her tattoo had become part of a larger tradition of military remembrance, one that connected past and present, individual and community, trauma and healing. Morrison approached as she was preparing to leave the memorial wall, his expression serious but hopeful. "Staff Sergeant," he said quietly, "I have something for you." He handed her a thick folder containing dozens of letters from soldiers who had participated in the Memorial and Resilience Program, family members of fallen soldiers, and veterans who had been inspired by her story to seek help for their own trauma. "These are thank you letters," Morrison explained, "from people whose lives have been changed by what grew out of that day when I made the biggest mistake of my life." Maria accepted the folder, feeling the weight of all the stories and gratitude it contained. "Morrison," she said, "that mistake you made led to something good. It forced important conversations, created positive change, and helped a lot of people. That doesn't excuse what you did, but it shows that even our worst moments can become opportunities for growth and redemption." As Maria left Fort Braxton that evening, she carried with her the knowledge that her story and the stories of the soldiers whose names she bore would continue to inspire and teach for years to come.
2 years after the incident that changed everything, Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Vasquez, now Sergeant First Class Vasquez, stood before an audience at the Pentagon preparing to deliver her final report on the Memorial and Resilience Program. The program had exceeded all expectations, expanding from a pilot program at 5 bases to a military-wide initiative that had served over 15,000 soldiers and had fundamentally changed how the military approached combat trauma and memorial traditions. The journey from that moment of confrontation with Private Morrison to this culminating presentation had been longer and more complex than anyone could have predicted. What had started as a simple correction of disrespectful behavior had evolved into a comprehensive approach to healing that honored the past while building resilience for the future. The Memorial and Resilience Program's success, Maria began, addressing an audience that included generals, mental health professionals, and policymakers, demonstrates that healing and remembrance are not competing priorities, but complementary aspects of comprehensive trauma treatment. The statistics she presented were compelling. Soldiers who participated in the program showed a 67% reduction in symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. More significantly, participants reported higher levels of unit cohesion, improved understanding of military traditions, and increased willingness to seek mental health support when needed. But the program's true impact, Maria continued, cannot be measured solely in clinical outcomes or statistical improvements. Its greatest success has been in creating a culture where trauma and memorial traditions are understood as connected aspects of military service. In the audience, General Hayes nodded approvingly. Over the past 2 years, she had watched Maria evolve from a talented NCO with a personal story into a military-wide expert on trauma treatment and memorial culture. The transformation had been remarkable, but it had come at a cost that only those closest to Maria fully understood. The process of sharing her story repeatedly, of reliving traumatic experiences in service of helping others, had taken its toll. There were nights when the weight of carrying so many stories, both her own and those of program participants, felt overwhelming. There were moments when Maria questioned whether the constant exposure to trauma narratives was healthy for her own recovery. But there were also moments of profound meaning and connection. Letters from Gold Star families thanking her for keeping their loved ones' memories alive. Messages from soldiers whose lives had been changed by the program. Stories of healing and growth that grew directly from the foundation she had helped create. Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had become Maria's closest collaborator in developing the program's psychological framework, had watched Maria navigate the challenges of repeated trauma exposure with growing concern and admiration. Maria has demonstrated something we rarely see in trauma treatment, Dr. Martinez had told General Hayes during one of their quarterly reviews. She's found a way to transform personal pain into collective healing without losing herself in the process.
That's extraordinarily difficult to achieve. As Maria concluded her presentation, she reflected on the unexpected paths that military service could take. She had enlisted as a young woman seeking economic opportunity and personal growth. She had never imagined that her combat experiences, her personal trauma, and even a moment of public humiliation would become the foundation for helping thousands of other soldiers heal from their own wounds. The Memorial and Resilience Program will continue to evolve, Maria told her audience, but its core principle will remain constant, that remembrance and healing are not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of honoring service and building resilience. After the presentation, Maria found herself in conversations with military leaders from around the world who were interested in implementing similar programs in their own forces. The approach that had grown out of one recruit's mockery and one NCO's response had become a model for military trauma treatment that was being studied internationally. But perhaps the most meaningful conversation of the day came with an unexpected visitor. Jake Morrison, now Sergeant Morrison, and serving as an instructor at the Army's Leadership School, had requested permission to attend Maria's presentation. "Sergeant First Class Vasquez," Morrison said as he approached her after the formal proceedings had concluded, "I wanted you to see what became of the soldier who laughed at your tattoo 2 years ago." Morrison had continued his transformation long after leaving Fort Braxton. He had thrown himself into military history, leadership development, and mentoring young soldiers with the passion of someone seeking redemption through service. His story of personal growth had become part of the Memorial and Resilience Program's curriculum, demonstrating that even profound mistakes could become opportunities for positive change. "Morrison," Maria replied, "I can see that you've become exactly the kind of leader the Army needs. Your journey from that day at Fort Braxton to this moment shows what's possible when people commit to learning and growing from their mistakes." Morrison's eyes filled with tears as he responded, "I've spent 2 years trying to make amends for what I said that day. I've shared our story with hundreds of soldiers, always emphasizing the disrespect I showed and the lessons I learned. But I need you to know that your response, the way you turned my ignorance into a teaching moment, changed not just my understanding of military service, but my understanding of leadership itself." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I tell every soldier I train about the names on your tattoo, about Rodriguez and Walsh and Thompson and all the others. I make sure they understand that every symbol, every tradition, every story in the military represents real people who made real sacrifices. That lesson has probably prevented hundreds of moments like the one I created." Maria felt a sense of completion that she hadn't expected. The young soldier who had caused her so much pain and frustration had become an advocate for exactly the kind of respect and understanding she had tried to teach. "Morrison, your transformation gives meaning to that difficult day. It shows that even painful experiences can lead to positive outcomes if we're willing to learn from them." 3 months later, Maria received a letter that would influence the next chapter of her life. Sarah Rodriguez, the daughter of Specialist Marcos Rodriguez, whose name appears prominently on Maria's tattoo, had been accepted to graduate school to pursue a master's degree in military history and memorial studies.
"Dear Sergeant First Class Vasquez," the letter began, "I wanted you to know that I've decided to dedicate my academic career to studying military memorial traditions and their impact on families and communities. Your tattoo and the story behind it inspired me to understand how personal remembrance connects to larger cultural practices of honoring service and sacrifice." The letter continued with Sarah's plans to research memorial tattoos, military memorial culture, and the ways that individual acts of remembrance contribute to collective healing. She had been awarded a fellowship to study at a prestigious university where she would have access to military archives and the opportunity to interview veterans about their memorial practices. "I plan to write my thesis about memorial tattoos in the military, focusing on how they serve not just individual healing, but community education and cultural preservation. Your tattoo will be featured as a case study if you're willing to participate in the research."
Maria was honored by the request and immediately agreed to participate. The idea that her personal memorial could contribute to academic understanding of military culture felt like another way of honoring the soldiers whose names she carried. A year later, Sarah Rodriguez defended her master's thesis, titled Ink and Memory: Memorial Tattoos as Sites of Military Remembrance and Community Education. The research had expanded to include interviews with dozens of veterans who had memorial tattoos, analysis of the cultural and psychological functions these tattoos served, and recommendations for military policies that supported healthy memorial practices. Maria attended the thesis defense, sitting in the audience as Sarah presented research that had grown directly from the story of her father's death and Maria's decision to memorialize it permanently on her skin. The academic presentation felt like the completion of a circle that had begun with Rodriguez's death in Afghanistan and had evolved through Morrison's disrespect, the development of the Memorial and Resilience Program, and now into scholarly research that would influence military policy and practice. During the question and answer session, one committee member asked Sarah about the personal connection she had to her research subject. My father, Specialist Marcus Rodriguez, is one of the soldiers whose name appears on Sergeant First Class Vasquez's memorial tattoo. I never knew my father. He was killed when I was a baby. But through Sergeant Vasquez's tattoo and her willingness to share his story, I've been able to understand his service and sacrifice in ways that would not have been possible otherwise. She looked directly at Maria as she continued. This research is personal for me, but it's also important for military families and communities. Memorial tattoos like Sergeant Vasquez's serve as bridges between individual grief and collective memory, between private trauma and public honor. They demonstrate that remembrance can be both healing and educational. After the successful defense, Maria and Sarah sat together in a quiet coffee shop near the university, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. I never imagined when I got that tattoo that it would become part of academic research, Maria said. I just wanted to make sure your father and the others weren't forgotten. That's exactly why it became academically important, Sarah replied. Your tattoo demonstrates that the most meaningful memorial traditions grow out of genuine relationships and authentic grief, not from abstract policies or institutional requirements. As their conversation continued, Maria realized that her story had evolved far beyond her personal experience or even the Memorial and Resilience Program. It had become part of a larger understanding of how military communities process trauma, honor sacrifice, and maintain connections between past and present. 5 years after that first confrontation with Morrison, Maria was offered a promotion to Master Sergeant and a new assignment that would take her to the Army War College, where she would help develop advanced leadership training that incorporated the lessons learned from the Memorial and Resilience Program. The assignment represented the culmination of a career that had taken unexpected turns and achieved impacts she never could have predicted. From a young soldier seeking opportunity to a combat veteran carrying trauma, to a senior NCO whose personal story had influenced military-wide policy, Maria's journey reflected the complex paths that military service could create. But as she prepared to take on this new role, Maria made one final stop at Fort Braxton, returning to the place where everything had changed. The base memorial wall had been expanded to include a new section dedicated to soldiers who had died by suicide, reflecting the military's growing recognition of the connections between combat trauma and mental health crises. Maria met her at the memorial wall, now a seasoned instructor with his own reputation for developing thoughtful, respectful soldiers. They stood together in comfortable silence, reading names and remembering stories. Sergeant First Class, I have something to show you, Morrison said. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal a new tattoo, a simple design that incorporated his unit insignia, the dates of his military service, and a small inscription that read, Honor through understanding. I got this to remind myself the lesson you taught me that day, not just about respecting memorial traditions, but about the power of authentic stories to change hearts and minds.
Maria studied the tattoo, noting its careful design and meaningful symbolism. It's beautiful, Morrison, but more importantly, it represents your growth and commitment to honoring military traditions. As the sun set over Fort Braxton, Maria reflected on the unexpected legacy that had grown from one moment of disrespect and one decision to respond with truth rather than anger. The names on her tattoo, Rodriguez, Walsh, Thompson, and all the others, had become more than personal memories. They had become symbols of sacrifice that continued to inspire, educate, and heal. The story that had begun with mockery had evolved into a testament to the power of authentic storytelling, the importance of military traditions, and the possibility of transformation even in the face of profound mistakes. It was a story that would continue to influence soldiers and military families for generations to come, ensuring that the sacrifice of those whose names were carried in ink and memory would never be forgotten. As Maria left Fort Braxton for the final time as a visiting instructor, she carried with her the knowledge that her tattoo and the story behind it had become part of military history. But more importantly, she carried the satisfaction of knowing that Rodriguez, Walsh, Thompson, and all the others lived on not just in her memory, but in the hearts and minds of countless soldiers who had learned to honor sacrifice through understanding.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.